This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Mr. Mike Studeman, a MITRE National Security Fellow who serves on the Board of Advisors of the National Bureau of Asian Research. Mr. Studeman previously served as the commander of the Office of Naval Intelligence and is a retired Rear Admiral. He's an internationally recognized expert on Asian affairs with deep expertise on China. Mr. Studeman joins us today for a discussion on the rising tensions between the United States and the People's Republic of China and the geopolitical implications of Trump's trade war. Stay with us as we speak with Mike Studeman. Mike Studeman, thanks so much for joining NatSec Matters.
Yeah, great to be here, Michael. Look forward to our conversation.
Well, Mike, you have been long a real expert on China. You have a distinguished career in service of your country in recent years, of course, in the U.S. military. I look forward to getting any number of policy issues out of you today. But let's talk first about what is on the top of everyone's mind, and that is the geopolitical implications of Trump's trade war. At the outset, let's just start at basic principles here. What is Trump's China policy?
Well, I think some basic outlines are understood, but I don't think the fulsome China policy is very clear yet. I mean, we've elevated above all other security concerns, the border issues and immigration and China. And so we'll be spending some time on the homeland, and then we'll be trying to do perhaps a better job in a rivalry with China. I mean, this is not we'll win it in 4 years kind of thing. It will be with us, I think, for many, many decades to come. And so we need to actually have a very clear-eyed view of the dangers that China poses. We need to distinguish benign from malign. And I think that's where we need to have more communications from the senior leaders in the administration. I mean, they're onboarding, some of their key members kind of down the chain. People need time to set their new strategy, articulate it, and then be able to start implementing it. So, look, it's still too early, I think, to be able to understand every element.
Yeah.
The question, for example, of Taiwan remains unclear to many people, whether or not we'll continue to support and potentially defend Taiwan, or if it's maybe a huge blue chip as part of some kind of grand bargain where economics rules the day rather than security issues or anything else. And so we'll see.
Okay, good. Yeah, definitely. We're definitely coming back to Taiwan here in a minute. Tell me a little bit, and I follow you on X, and you put together one-page slides, which I think are really instructive. I was looking at one of the things that you put out recently about how China will exploit Washington's America First orientation to expand their global strategic influence. I wonder if you might try and unpack that a little bit for the audience, and then we'll, get around to the question of President Trump's economic policy towards China and whether we're playing these trade relations right.
Yeah, what works domestically to earn votes to get into office can be completely counterproductive on the international scene. And I think we're finding that's the case with America First. It may not be America alone, but that's the way it comes off to most people. And so it's very off-putting to the point where people are really starting to seriously hedge against America.
And who? Tell me who's hedging? Southeast Asia or?
The Europeans are hedging. Everybody in the EU and NATO that's getting not just a cold shoulder, but, insulted with regard to, what they've done or what they will do. I mean, NATO is going to have to, figure out how it's going to actually navigate between hostile hegemons that include Russia, China, and increasingly viewing the United States and some of the volatility and the lack of trust and the changes in the approach that we've had throughout, all of our post-World War II history. Those kinds of things force nations to hedge, and those are our closest partners. When you take a look at the ones that we like to make deeper partners in critical areas of concern, for example, the Western Pacific, putting lots of tariffs on many countries that we want to also work on security issues with tends to create this cross-purpose sort of, dynamic where you can end up working a trade issue and essentially be earning, very poor credit or very hostile sentiments with regard to what America may want to do with access-basing oversight or, working other kinds of security arrangements. And so it doesn't matter kind of where you are. There are things that the United States is doing that are completely rational for perhaps the what we want to do long term to bring industry and manufacturing back to the United States. But for now, the volatility and the consequences for everybody, markets that are seriously reducing savings for people getting blown up, the uncertainty of the whole thing, not knowing where it's going, not having predictability, all of it suggests that America not only is less reliable, but in fact is becoming one of the most dangerous forces that they have to contend with.
So I've heard people suggest, and let's go back to the trade policy, that a more sensible way to go about this would have been to make common cause with the European Union and other allies around the world so that we were jointly bringing pressure on China, maybe to make structural reforms, but certainly to address overcapacity and a lot of this sort of mercantilistic behavior that we've become so accustomed to in the recent years. Is that what you mean? Would that have been a more sensible way to do it so that it's not at cross purposes, like you said?
I think policy choices are, a tightrope act. It's really difficult to try to, go the middle way and to get everything balanced just right. And so, the issue whether or not Europe needed shock therapy to be able to, politically muster up the courage to spend more on defense, even though, they don't have as much discretionary funding. And politically, it's political suicide for many politicians to take an extreme, view on this. But look, Ukraine was the shock therapy. They didn't need hectoring from the United States as much when you have a threat like Russia with a manifest aggression that's right there. However, it's frustrating to be on the American side and to say, hey, listen, if you had invested, in previous decades and essentially worked up to your 2% commitments, if not more, you probably would have had better deterrence, and this may not have been a problem at all, right? So this is a source of legitimate frustration that we have with Europe. Whether or not you go all the way over to the other side of the pendulum and now begin to insult or deprecate, your allies, there's a different story altogether. There's a way to handle that, I think, and it requires some tact and diplomacy and balancing. And yes, you have to be firm and strong on some issues, but I just think we've gone, from one end of the spectrum to the other.
So not necessarily the substance, but maybe the sequencing and how you raised a lot of these issues.
Yeah, I think there's an approach that works where you can still actually maintain trust with partners that you're going to want to have a coalition with or united front to deal with some of these other issues on great power rivalry, where in fact the red bloc is not just China now, it's China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, their client states. It's a huge amount of capability across the globe. And so we're going to need a blue coalition that's going to be able to lean on one another, that trusts one another. And look, you can end up shooting yourself in the foot if you over-prioritize in one area, and then essentially you become, overly aggressive and forceful in that area, maybe doing things that go beyond what is politically acceptable, particularly in set timeframes. If you push there, you can end up destroying the very areas of cooperation that you're going to need when you look at your higher priorities.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. And so should we see, as many in the media said, Xi Jinping's recent trip around Southeast Asia as an effort to remind them that they're a more stable ally maybe than we are? How did you see the trip, and what do you think, what exactly are the Chinese doing to try and steal a march on us?
Well, I think Xi Jinping has been out abroad for his entire tenure. He's been very good about going out and spiking a lot of deals that, were put in place by ambassadors, and a whole lot of effort from the elements of his government that are working, economically, diplomatically, informationally, very, very hard all the time. And then he comes in and makes the rounds, and then has, these huge diplomatic successes that lead to economic relationships that suggest that, China has a intricate web upon web network now of relationships they can draw on, not only for extracting the resources, but also markets for Chinese goods. So look, that's been happening for quite some time. I think Cambodia, Malaysia, Vietnam, that trip was probably long planned there. And so it looked, like it was designed to essentially show that China has an opening. And I think they probably, because of circumstances, did have a better ability to pull those governments and those leaders toward a Chinese view, given the tariffs being applied to all of those countries. So I definitely think China was given a gift with regard to the general climate that exists internationally right now. Now, you also saw the Chinese trying to work on, the ROK, South Koreans and the Japanese, and with, contacts with the Europeans. So they're trying to capitalize there on essentially this anger and frustration that exists across the board with what's happening in Washington. So yes, it's a windfall for the Chinese in terms of propaganda, where they can say, hey, America, like we told you for many years now, is unilateralist, it's aggressive, it's unpredictable, you shouldn't put your stock into them, you can't trust America as an ally, they'll walk away from you. Taiwan, for example, that's how they play the Taiwan propaganda. And so this really, when you take a look at what it's given to the Chinese, has given new life to them in ways where they were really on the ropes. Reputationally, economically, in many other ways, it was looking really tough with China because we had such a strong allied and partner coalition that essentially was willing to work with us on a whole host of issues.
So let me get your take on how the Biden administration did in its China policy. The president, and we'll get into Taiwan here as well, I mean, President Biden did say on at least 3 occasions that, yes, the United States military would be involved if the Chinese were to mount a cross-straits invasion. So that seemed to be rhetoric in the service of deterrence, which was helpful. Do you think that was a useful series of statements that President Biden made? And just generally, what did you think of their policy?
In general, I thought they worked allies and partners well. They recovered from the previous administration that had left allies and partners in tatters in many ways. They patched that up, and then they built it to something that was very, very strong and was very effective. And that's what's unraveling now, right? So in that score, in that area, that department, I think you deliver an A there. And the fact that they had to respect the limits of how fast certain governments can go. That's understanding other cultures, other systems, leadership issues, et cetera. I think they had a better empathetic understanding of the conditions that exist within individual states and how far they could push and where they had opportunities, et cetera. Informationally, I think they screwed the pooch. I was frustrated while I was in uniform, frustrated out of uniform. They couldn't seem to find their way out of what information bag. And it's very frustrating because I have equal criticism now for multiple administrations. Like informationally, you've got to have the tools. You've got to have the messaging. It shows up in lots of different levels and forms there, but we have not been informationally strong in a very long time, since the Cold War. And I thought the administration before this, the Biden administration, had tools, and they just didn't have the will or maybe the proficiency to be able to talk about China in a way that was required. And therefore, Americans were less aware of exactly why we were doing what we're doing. And it was done for the sake of strategic stability. I understand that they wanted to have good relations and not have things spiral out of control. We did demonizing each other, closes that opportunity for cooperation. We had to manage that very important strategic relationship. I get that, but not educating the American people about what we have to do and what the real dangers are was a huge opportunity cost that we're feeling still today.
I agree with you. I remember thinking all along that Biden needed to give a speech. Even if I am not a Biden supporter, I felt like the president needed to say what our policy is. And it instead was just left to Tony Blinken on invest, align, and compete, which I guess was a good place to start. But I don't really believe that Biden gave an address on, hey, America, here's the threat, and here's what we need to do about it.
Yeah, and not for lack of having those recommendations within the NSC to do that sort of thing. But if it was beyond him, or if he's uncomfortable because he's not, a China expert, and nobody is at that level. But assign somebody and give them the delegated responsibility. Kirk Campbell, Russ Doshi, Jake Sullivan. All of them could have been able to talk more. They did talk some, but not enough, and not to America, not consistently, and therefore you had things like the balloon all of a sudden was a shock to America, right? The critical infrastructure penetration by, red adversaries. I mean, the list goes on, right? They needed to connect the dots and essentially explain how this all hangs together and how China is approaching the rejuvenation of their country and what it means for how they've exploited ours and where the danger points are and how we have to address those. That did not come across as a campaign thing, which is, by the way, how you use your information instrument. Is to educate your own population as well as to go outward and do public diplomacy and have conversations with the world. We decided to essentially bag on having conversations with a country. And even today with this administration, I'm not sure we can have a fact-based, informed, balanced conversation with a country about what's going on. And so there's got to be something between undertreated and overheated. And once again, the tightrope walk that I was explaining before, we have to take that walk, and we have to do the balancing all the way across the chasm. And it takes some skill and experience and knowledge and all the rest. But we haven't put China people up forward to explain China issues to the United States. And the entertainment industry is not doing it because Hollywood is beholden to the Chinese. They've fully captured Hollywood. Academia won't do it because, they're writing intellectual pieces and they know that if they're too critical of China, that they'll lose access into China and raw, primary source material, that they need to be, good academics. And so they're largely fairly reserved about these things, very careful. And think tanks are producing a lot of great stuff, but it goes into the think tank world. That's like the intellectual elites talking to the intellectual elites. Nobody is deciding to sort of say, let me educate you consistently and contextually about why we're doing what we're doing and how we're going to have to approach this, and allowing people to learn. You need government to do that. And frankly, you're going to need the entertainment industry to start producing movies and TV series, just like we did about Russia, to explain that sort of stuff to Americans that may only learn through that kind of medium.
Fascinating. A minute ago, you said that the Trump tariff policy might be unraveling, I think was the word you used, some of our relationships. And so let me press you on that. I mean, it's still early. We're just 100 days into that. I agree that the Liberation Day reciprocity tariffs were jolting to many of our allies around the world. But is there still time to turn it around? I mean, it's early days here.
Yeah, no, I do. That's an important caveat to make on all this stuff. We sometimes lose a sense of time, and it's only been, slightly over 100 days. And so, administrations learn. Ideally, you don't learn through, the school of hard knocks and hard lessons that every American will feel. That's what's going on, I think, now or potentially now. And, so I give every leadership team credit for being able to adapt and, refine kind of their way ahead. But, you got a lot of rhetoric out there. You still got the American first sort of banner flying, strong, and these things continue to roil, the world. And frankly, this intangible thing, if you're looking at things through a business proposition and you go, my return on investment is X, my bottom line is I've earned this much more, then you don't really understand how geopolitics works. There's a great deal of opportunity that exists when you've built trust that creates more opportunity to close additional transactions of a security type, of an economic type, and a diplomatic type, and it allows you to actually open doors to an amazing amount of stuff that actually should be measured and isn't consistently measured, right?
Right.
So what have we been able to work with Europe since World War II because we took that kind of approach? I mean, if you have $1.4 trillion worth of economic trade going between Europe and the United States per annum, you ought to say, look, a lot of what we did before was very successful here. I'm not talking trade deficit and those kinds of things, which I think are misconstrued and not fully understood. I'm talking about the benefit that you get from having a trusted partnership where all parties respect the rule of law and are able to execute and simply develop together and make the world a better place and increase the standard of living and strengthen security. That's
Got
what
it.
we built over time with key zones of partnerships. That's what's being shaken, and that's where you find that people are hacking at the roots, and that ascent, can also become a descent and a spiral. And that's the concern that this unraveling I talk about starts to lay sticks of dynamite against the relationships, and you're not invited into meetings, or you're not going to be taken seriously, and you're certainly not going to be a partner that people are going to want to run to in order to do X, Y, or Z. That's the challenge, I think, which is really difficult to measure, but it's actually an intangible that has real impact.
Yeah, that's really well said. I want to get to Taiwan, and then I want to come back around to this thing that you raised, which is people in Washington wondering whether President Trump wants to do a grand deal with Xi Jinping, which might yield a major policy change in how the United States treats Taiwan. But before we go there, one of your slides is about why Taiwan matters. And in addition to presidents of late not talking about our China policy, I don't believe there's many people out there that are really articulating how disastrous the loss of Taiwan would be. I mean, let's just get to basic principles here. Our economy and American prosperity, which at the end of the day, I think is the primary purpose of our national security and foreign policy. Will you talk a little bit about what China would gain and what America would lose if Taiwan is lost?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I appreciate that. I did a slide when I was the director of intelligence at INDOPACOM, because we had so many congressmen and senior leaders coming in, and that was often the question. I'm like, look, I'm just going to write it down. It should be a J5 thing, but I'm going to write this thing down and talk about how important Taiwan is. There's an article I think Ms. Kavanaugh wrote in Foreign Affairs, which argued Taiwan isn't as important as you think it is. It's not worth a war. Be very careful about how many chips you put, over Taiwan. It's not a domino theory thing. And so you need to have a very sober view of Taiwan. I agree with her to a point. But I also believe that, if you're talking about, the front lines of where the 21st century is going to be recreated, Taiwan sits right there. Japan sits there, the Philippines, et cetera. And so let's first start with that in the Indo-Pacific, you're talking about, 50 to 60% of the global economy generated there. And it is rated to potentially be 70% of a global economy in 2050. And so, look, the economics of that region matter. We've always held as a country that we can't afford to have an adversary essentially dominate over in Europe, another source of, vital economic production, or in the Western Pacific, right? And this is the issue with, China, and Taiwan's kind of right in the center of all of that. And it is very real. If, in fact, we back away and do nothing when Taiwan looks like it's going to be jeopardized and, it's fighting for its life, then, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Philippines, Australia, everybody's looking at this going, okay, now I know how strong the United States is or how weak the United States is, whether it's military capability or if it's political will. Those judgments really matter for how those countries then bandwagon or hedge at least or bandwagon with the Chinese, because now you're taking a look at, China having been able to take care of their supreme sovereignty issue, right? And so it would bring new forms of legitimacy within China. It would embolden Xi Jinping and company to go pursue all the other sovereign territorial ambitions that they have, which include chunks of the first island chain in the East China Sea going into Japan's EEZ to go after oil and gas, as well as in the first island chain in the South China Sea, where you have all those claimants.
Well, let me ask you there, and then we want to come back. One of your bullet point, and I want to get back to the EEZ in a second, but also you've mentioned domination of global sea lanes and choke points. Some people would say, well, you know what, the Chinese don't have an economic interest in, choking off the South China Sea. And so therefore, it's not really going to matter if they control the first island chain. I mean, what are they going to do? Are they going to blockade U.S. commercial ships from coming through? How is that really tangibly going to affect the United States?
Yeah, I mean, they depend on those sea lines of communication as well and for trade. But essentially, they're saying that's our lake. And for the water column, all the way down to the seabed and all the exploration there that could yield anything of value, the Chinese essentially say, that's mine. And so what you're doing is essentially running into 6 or 7 different claimants and saying, might makes right, and I'm going to assert my control over all of this. You can make a deal with me, potentially, maybe we can have an arrangement, but that is definitely Chinese, and I have full rights to claim ownership over this.
But would they do it? You think they would come after us and lock us out?
They have already, where they were, when the Chinese moved, I wrote my thesis on this in my master's courses about their move onto Mischief Reef. And that was all designed so they would have essentially a stake in that area to be able to claim what the Philippines was contracting out with international companies to explore, the gas and oil in the zones around Mischief Reef. They wanted to have a stake there. They could say, not only build up and monitor, but they can actually then extend their influence and get, effective control over those areas. When Vietnam also does the same thing with international companies to explore, there have been countless cases of the Chinese trying to ward off, the Vietnamese from doing legitimate things within their, EEZ and fairly, close sometimes to the Vietnamese coast. So look, when the Chinese, feel like, their stakes are threatened, they're the ones coming out with the water cannoning and the ramming and the sinking and the sonic, acoustic devices that they use, lasers, all the rest. That's just a taste of what you might expect, later on as they become even more powerful. And I should remind you that it's not just about the sea areas, it's about the airspace above, right? So the Chinese will they'll bring that in at one point where essentially they're going to control the air zones, over the South China Sea, which means essentially you have to mother may I to the Chinese to go through the international commons. And once you set that in just one place, that has important, precedent-setting impacts for other areas, right? And so you can't sort of just say, well, this is going to be the one exception, right? The Chinese will run through that with a Mack truck, right? You can't give daylight there. You stand up for what's right and true within the international system. Otherwise, nothing is worth, right? It's essentially a hollow, agreement, unclose, and it's become just a Hobbesian world, right?
Yeah.
Anybody that has the strength can violate any rule that they want.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Mike Studeman.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
I like the point you made about historically speaking, in terms of American grand strategy, that you can't have an adversary be able to dominate one region of the world. I mean, I think I can think of some historical parallels, but unpack that a little bit. That's interesting.
It's just been if you look at most of our theory of success in foreign relations over decades, it's crossed multiple administrations. That has been the case there until the Trump teams have come in, that those were the two inviolate areas where you couldn't allow Russia to dominate Europe or China to dominate the Indo-Pacific. Those were very clear-cut areas where we had to hold the line because the international order, but the engine of growth that is so key to the strength of countries to be able to defend their own sovereignty and security, prosperity, and values, all of those things would be at stake if you allowed dominion to be ceded to Moscow and to Beijing, right?
Yeah.
Taiwan is a top 10 trading partner, and it's not just semiconductors. The semiconductors, best in the world, 90% of the high-end stuff, we still depend on them. We've got fabs that are being produced, and Taiwan's helping with those in America, but those take years and years to produce, and they're not anywhere close to matching the output or the quality, yet, even as we work with South Korea, Japan, and others, to further diversify. So we have a huge dependency on that alone. But they have other electronics. They've got great manufacturing within Taiwan. Taiwan actually invests like 40% of their foreign direct investment outgoing goes to the United States. And so they're a vital economic source of prosperity there upon which America depends. They're also a thriving Chinese-speaking democracy, by the way, which shows the world, and in fact, democracies and Chinese culture actually do, they are compatible and they do work together. And so Taiwan shows the way. And this is one of the galling aspects, to Beijing, is that Taiwan's success suggests that their line within China, that the CCP is the only real governance organizational approach to be able to be successful, just is not true. And so for many reasons there, but imagine this, right? I mean, you can start talking about whether ROK goes nuclear or Japan goes nuclear. If our defense of Taiwan, we're called upon by the Taiwan Relations Act to provide sufficient material defensive capability to Taiwan so that China does not try to physically reconcile or politically get a resolution through aggressive means. We're called upon to do that. If we fail there, then either without fighting or with fighting, Tokyo and all these other countries in the West Pacific have to decide what they're going to do to protect themselves. And so that includes the nuclear umbrella. We call it extended deterrence, but Japan's going to have to really think, can I totally depend on Washington? Because they failed to really show either the capability or the will or the staying power to protect Taiwan, a former mutual defense treaty ally, and South Korea even closer. 70% of the South Koreans want to go nuclear.
Yeah.
So they would go there. So you have nuclear proliferation consequences. I mean, the list sort of goes on, but that gives you kind of some of the main, tenets of it. And just to conclude, it's 23 million people who are not under the boot of communist China. Right. It matters when you think about being a compassionate person that understands what freedom is like, and once you lose it, so letting them become another Hong Kong and facing the police state, that's a moral and a values issue that should weigh into our calculus in all of this.
Okay, so there are moral reasons, there's human rights reasons, there's democracy reasons, there's profound economic security reasons to stick with Taiwan before you even get to semiconductors. There's so many economic issues. But let me ask you, because a leading China hawk said, while Taiwan is incredibly important, it's not existential to the United States. What's your take on that?
Look, multiple administrations have essentially said Taiwan is a vital national security interest. So, there are very few things that are truly existential, right? And so let's put a common sense caveat to using those words. Just taking an extreme point of view on all of it. It's in our vital national interest. And that's a period, stop, underline, bold it, and then get out and do the right things, right? And so, look, I do think we're trying to strengthen, our deterrence, but it's better that we do so, with friends, and we should be trying to win friends and influence in the right kind of ways. And, it's really important that we get some harmony with policies. Like every administration, has these problems. Everybody could be a critic that's not up in the cabinet, kind of working these things. But ideally, you have an end state in mind. You've articulated it and you've sold it persuasively to the American people so they can make the hard choices that are required, particularly if it's a bigger issue, tougher issue, requiring maybe more of America. And then you actually execute with facts and information that people can rely on. You provide updates, you implement throughout, right? And you navigate depending on how things change over time. All that requires you to articulate sort of the grand strategy of the United States. And I don't see that many administrations have done that, very well at all, not since the Cold War, at least. Yeah. And so that's a deficiency, that I think that requires some time and energy.
So I totally agree with you on all this. Before we get to the big question about whether we'll revisit the Davidson window in a second, we'll ask, and I'll put the hard, big question to you about whether Xi Jinping will do it and when. But before we get there, I always want to bring up that China's not 10 feet tall, and all we see is catastrophic articles about how much they're spending militarily, how proficient they are, how much, they're in a war footing, et cetera, and we're not. But can I ask you just sort of an optimistic type question? What do we make of the Chinese? What are their weaknesses? Sometimes we talk about, I don't know, how should I weigh corruption in the Chinese military? How much should I weigh that they haven't had a war since they fought Vietnam in 1979? Are they 10 feet tall? How worried should we be?
I always say they're 8 feet tall, and you better be careful if you're not 8 feet tall either. Look, I think some people overblow, but I think more are not studied on the issue and are shooting behind the duck and don't understand how much capability and military might the Chinese have built. And when you're thinking about executing an operation that's right near your shores, and it's a away game for us and it's a home game for them, when you have, incredible manufacturing capability, when you have state support and all the rest, when you're fully exploiting America from the inside for our intellectual property and feeding that right into civil military fusion, into the PLA war machine, we are going to be surpassed. And we're talking about this being a pacing threat. And then you'll have more people saying, how far am I being outpaced in terms of capability? And so, there's a reason why everyone is after our DoD acquisition process, because it's failing. And there are a lot of different reasons why we have structure the way it is. A lot of the blame goes right on to Congress's shoulders until Congress figures out a way to loosen its micromanagement grip over acquisition with all the rules, including 1-year budgeting, which is the silliest thing ever for what you want to do with American private industry that needs predictability and multi-year budgets. CRs all on Congress. Congress has more, I think, to do to check itself and to be able to change things if you really want to compete with the Chinese. Because right now, their machine has higher RPMs and creating more material than our machine, right? And after a certain point, it doesn't matter that, you didn't fight since 1979. You got strict hierarchy, so they're not going to be as independently minded to make like dynamic decisions in a fluid combat environment, or that there are a few people that are corrupt. In fact, almost everybody in the Chinese military, particularly at senior level, is corrupt, right? Those won't make a hill of beans of difference when you have so much, weight of iron and firepower to throw near your shores to be able to achieve your objectives. And that's the problem.
Yeah.
Is that the Chinese do have their weaknesses, but they've been compensating for all those with the amount of capability in every warfare domain, including the stuff that we just don't, the invisibles matter. What you do in space, cyber, and electronic warfare is, it's eye-watering to watch the Chinese put so much capability there, while you can't convince most Americans, that we need to really invest in those to the extent that our nation really needs, right?
Yeah.
It's tough to watch.
Okay, good stuff. As we begin to wrap up here, let's check the clock. Does the Davidson window, which as I recall is the end of 2027, that's the window by which the Chinese military should at least be capable or minimally capable of mounting a cross-straits invasion. Does that still hold? And then do you agree, and will they, then there's a subsequent political decision that Xi Jinping will have to make about whether to actually go for the invasion. And then the third part of the question is, when would he do it? Some people say it would be the beginning of what would that be, fourth term. Why don't you riff on these critical questions for a second?
Yeah, I think though this is a decisive decade, as we call the 2020s, and the way I talk about it in my judgment, as someone who's been looking at this for 35 years and spending a lot of time in the traffic, is that the most dangerous period is probably the late 20s and early 30s, and that is in the fourth term of Xi Jinping, and it would go from 27 to 2032. He's getting older. His impatience is very clear on this. But look, there's no iron countdown. And so Xi Jinping probably regrets, ever saying anything about 2027, whatever, but he laid down the mandate at the 100th, centenary of the PLA to be ready to be able to execute anything that he asked them to execute, up to not just an invasion of Taiwan, but an invasion that factors in intervention by, the United States, like a major power, right? And so that's what the sprinting that you're saying, the fastest growth of modern military capability by the Chinese globally, and over the course of almost a century, that kind of stuff that you're seeing is all efforts to meet Xi Jinping's deadlines, right? So he's doing that for a reason. Now, it's not an iron countdown to say, okay, so May, of 2027, you're going to go no matter what. It's just not how the Chinese work. I try to talk about this, and there's another slide I put out there, Michael, you'll probably remember it as a triangle. And it's essentially, it's not an issue of whether or not the intentions are there or the capabilities are being built up, right? It's the opportunity angle in the triangle. And so if the vertices meet, you're going to have a problem, Houston. So the capabilities being pressed down, the intentions being pressed down, the opportunity thing. Now, what is that defined by? Well, that's defined by a lot of things. China's domestic conditions, the United States domestic conditions, right? Are we so polarized we can't make a single decision? We can't unite as a country. What's the willpower of the United States president right, regarding Taiwan? That is a huge factor, right? And it opens up opportunities if they take one stance, and it might close down opportunities if they take another, right?
Yeah.
What does the international community think about China and Taiwan? Are they going to stand on the sidelines? Are they going to cheer the Chinese? Or are they going to sanction them like the Western sanction playbook that we threw at Russia? That's a calculation. What does the allied system look like in the Western Pacific? If I end up having an intervening power like the United States, will they bring in Japan? Will they also somehow pull in South Korea and Philippines and Australia? Am I going to face a coalition there? And then how fast can they, responsively react to it? And is that going to be something I can take on? And then finally, it's the thing that most people start with, which is a military correlation of forces. And then what I described were strategic contexts. There were specific areas that they'll be judging and looking at, sensing the entire time to be able to know whether or not these stars are aligning or not. And if you are successful to be able to deal with these other conditions there, then you will close out China's, willingness to, reduce the temptation for them to go. I mean, that's how that works. And so the Chinese calculus is based on opportunism, but you really have to have the strategic elements all line up, because if there's a propensity for victory, then they're going to try to sense where it is, and they're more likely to move out then versus a time-based, calculation. It's a different way of looking at the calculus.
I think I like that. I mean, it's also gives us an opportunity to have the right policies going forward so that we don't invite China to make an opportunistic decision and to move forward. So, well said. We have agency. We still need to do the right things, and we might be able to prevent it. Mike Studeman, thank you so much. This has been really instructive and interesting, and I hope you'll come back one day on NatSec Matters.
Yeah, these things all require, more digging down into the details. I appreciate how much we covered. Here's a wide swath, and Mike, I look forward to being on your show again and maybe going into more depth than just breadth.
Let's do it. That was Mike Studeman. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please rate and review the podcast. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.